Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and for over a year now, the mainstream media have been waxing lyrical about the upcoming general election with one surefire certainty in their thinking and certainly their writing: the polls would narrow. Many thought they would narrow before the election was even called. All thought they would narrow during the campaign itself. It's obvious, isn't it? They were all wrong. Now they're starting to express surprise as if it were unexpected. Yet, as I kept trying to point out myself during this time, not a single polling analyst ever said that the polls would inevitably narrow. In fact, they've been saying for a long time that although the polls might narrow, there was no reason to suppose they would. The latest polling is showing more and more tactical voting going on. One analyst puts it at double the level of tactical voting in 1997. Let me tell you, tactical voting was fairly big news back then. Obviously, there wasn't a great deal driving it. In 2024, we've got organised groups pushing it. Stop the Tories.vote has been actively pushing it. Other groups have been doing as well, trying to do their best to get it mentioned in the mainstream media, which really seems to hate talking about it. In fact, actually, if I just go on that, when you look at the coverage, even in the mainstream media, which has sometimes presented progressive causes, it's tragic to see how little anyone is talking about some of the major issues. Like, which do you think has been hidden the best in the mainstream media, including The Guardian? The Lib Dems, the Green Party, or tactical voting? They've all been handcuffed and tossed into the dungeon while the election has been going on, as if they're playing no part in it. And yet tactical voting is playing a massive part in this election, and the Liberal Democrats might become the official opposition. Not that you'd know it from reading the mainstream media news. Rishi Sunak has seen his approval ratings absolutely plummet over the course of the campaign, when they began pretty badly. Starmer's has risen at the same time. The reality of this campaign has been one of things getting worse for the Tories, not better. But journalists are behaving as if it's all a surprise. Oh, whoever could have predicted it? Analysts are having to now respond to those journalists by saying, we didn't say the polls would narrow. In fact, most analysts have been saying there's a good chance they wouldn't. I've done videos where I've taken actual polling data from previous general elections to show, no, there is no natural phenomenon of polls narrowing in either direction. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. The only credible source of expected poll narrowing for this election was from undecided voters, who are, of course, disproportionately former Conservative voters, turning up on the day deciding to stick with the Tories. But in order for Sunak to persuade a significant number of these voters to back him, he had to give a reason, and he hasn't. In 2017, the Conservatives fought a general election in the belief they could increase their majority enough to overrule the ERG on Brexit negotiations. They began with a large poll lead over Labour. But the campaign was unexpectedly bad from the Conservatives and pretty on message from Labour, and the result was the polls narrowed. But they narrowed not because of some natural law of polling, but because the Conservatives began with a large poll lead, but Labour had the better campaign. There was a reason for the polls narrowing. It just didn't happen by itself. The Tories lost that majority. In 2019, the Tories won a large majority. They didn't do it by winning lots more votes compared to their humiliation in 2017. Won hardly. It was like an extra 300,000 votes. That was it, out of 32 million people voting. What was instrumental was the Labour losing over 2.5 million votes compared to 2017. When looking ahead at elections, you cannot work on the basis that voters use their votes to support those falling behind just to make it a tighter race. They're voting for what they think is best, or the message that they want to send. The Conservatives have done absolutely nothing to appeal to any voters for years. They've allowed the major concerns of most voters to get worse: water pollution, cost of living crisis, NHS waiting lists, and so on. But they've also presided over things getting worse by their own metrics for the voters they did chase after, mostly on culture war issues, which just drove them into the grasping more of Reform UK. From a strategic point of view, the Conservatives have been getting almost everything wrong, whilst Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and even Reform UK have adopted a realistic strategy to win support. The ingredients for any narrowing of the polls just weren't there. And that was before we broached the subject of Sunak being personally awful in tough encounters. his cabinet being just as useless, and a 14-year legacy of absolutely zero achievements. Survation and Ipsos have both released voting intention polls this week based on telephone interviews. That avoids a lot of the Reform UK inflation we see in other polls. Their results were almost the same. 18% for the Conservatives, 14% for Reform with Survation, and then 1 point higher on each of those for Ipsos. So the gap's sort of the same there. Even if we accept the possibility that we could be looking at a particularly historic polling error when the results come out this year, even if you factor that in, which is, it's possible when you consider just how different this election is to anything I've ever known, and the largely untalked about threat of people being turned away from polling station due to voter ID issues, even then, the Tories are on for by far and away their lowest vote share, like ever. And the fact that so many postal ballots seem to have not been sent out, that's not good news for the Tories, like despite what you might think, because we know that a lot of, Labour in particular have pushed the idea of, get a postal vote if you're not sure about this. But actually, postal voting is disproportionately used by Conservative supporters. In 1997, the Conservatives were absolutely pounded. Like from one point of view, it was their worst ever result in terms of vote share. They got less than 30% of the vote. That would be a luxury now. Luxury. 31% would seem like an epic triumph for Sunak at this point. That was their big beating. And there's a real possibility now that their worst ever drubbing is going to be 50% better than what's waiting for them next week. When polls kept pointing out that the Tories had lost half of their 2019 support, the journalists just couldn't believe it. Now, understandable in a sense, it is pretty unbelievable that you can lose so much support within the span of literally a few years. And yet the polling picture has not changed. Only the attitudes of journalists who are now beginning to dimly see what has been evident for a very long time. The Tories did almost everything wrong. If an anti-Tory activist had worked on a plan to take over the Conservative Party and destroy it from within, you could hardly imagine a more perfect outcome than what we're seeing. It's been a masterclass in how not to run an election campaign, as well as how not to build towards an election campaign. Whoever the next Tory leader picks to run their next election campaign strategy, the first thing they'll probably suggest is, everything you did between 2021 and 2024. You're going to need to do the opposite of that. That is how awful they've been. And it shows just how unsuitable our most prominent journalists are. They didn't see that causal link between how the various political parties were approaching the election and what the polls were saying was going to happen, if they even bothered to pay attention. Or maybe they tried to pay attention and just didn't understand, because it doesn't occur to them to learn maybe how statistical analysis works, or to ask someone who already does understand. And then look at the Tories themselves. What they're doing right now. Right now, they're banging on about trans issues again. Remember last year when Lee Anderson said, yes, the Tories should probably run the election campaign on trans issues and culture wars. They weren't supposed to take him seriously. He's an idiot. But that's what they're doing. They're amplifying their transphobia. That's their plan. Just under 1 week before polling day, and the fact that they think this is a good idea should also have come as no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to Westminster politics for the past few years. Frankly, mainstream journalists should be embarrassed right now. They should be too embarrassed to come out and talk about the election. They should be urgently asking themselves why they ever supposed the polls would narrow. Because if they did, if they actually took a look at themselves and think, why did I think the polls would narrow? I think they are clever enough to realise that actually they had no basis for doing so. It was just a perception born of some sort of prejudice that they can't quite pin down, because it had not a splinter of scaffolding to support it. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.